Okay, this is going to be my third and I promise my final discussion of Trent Horn's recent video on moral savagery. There's one clip in his video where he talks about Canada and physician-assisted suicide, or what we call MAID legislation, medical assistance in dying legislation. He talks about it for just about maybe 10, 12, 15 seconds, but I thought that that was really interesting, and it's something I wanted to highlight. And thematically, it didn't fit into my previous two videos, so I've reserved this video to talk about this piece of his analysis. So we're going to play the clip. I'm going to say what I agree with, and then I'm going to conclude with what concerns me and what I disagree with, and what Trent had to say.
Canada has a higher white population than the United States, but they engage in a kind of human sacrifice through their assisted suicide program. Medically approved manslaughter is now the cause of death in 1 out of every 20 deaths in the country. It's also
Okay, so that's all that we're going to talk about by way of Trent's clip. That's all we're going to watch. But now I wanted to talk about both what I agree with and also what I am concerned with in what he had to say. So first of all, I'm not an expert in these issues by any means, but I did do a master's degree where my focus was on bioethics in my thesis, in particular on artificial reproductive technology. And along the way, I also devoted some not insignificant time to looking at the issues of passive and active euthanasia. So passive euthanasia, allowing a person to die by way of withdrawing hydration and or nutrition, and active euthanasia, actively killing a person. So in 2016, Canada passed what we call MAID legislation, again, medical assistance in dying, which is quite a euphemism, I would say. Um, and here's my central concern, and this is, I've actually got many concerns, but I think this is a good concern to start with, which is going to be in line with what Trent had to say. That initially, the medical assistance in dying legislation would grant as a right access to euthanasia to people who were suffering grievous irremediable conditions and expecting imminent death. But here's the key problem that has occurred time and again whenever physician assisted suicide, active euthanasia, has been granted as a right to various populations. There is a slippery slope that is initiated. And it's very clear to see why. Because once you invoke quality of life as a determining factor that would give a person a right to access physician assisted suicide, it's very tough to put a restraint on the expansion of that right. For example, this initial legislation would give people the right to access physician assisted suicide if they anticipated imminent death and were suffering terribly. So let's say maybe you anticipated, doctors anticipated that you would die in the next 2 weeks or something like that. Now, it was never explicitly defined what the time was, but let's say something like that. But then there are people who suffer grievous and irremediable conditions who do not anticipate death in the imminent future. In fact, they could live for years. And so they initially were also then pressuring the expansion of this right to include them, to give this right to them. And it's not hard to see the logic of their position. If the issue is to avoid suffering and uh, life that lacks a certain quality of life, and if people are then granted that right because they're going to suffer terribly over the next 2 weeks, well, what about the person who's going to suffer equivalently in a terrible way, but over years? Should they not even more have the access to physician assisted suicide? Because they will have even more suffering to look forward to in the future, which could be avoided through the exercise of that right. And that's what's happened is pretty soon the expectation of imminent death was removed and the right was expanded to people who were suffering terribly but did not anticipate imminent death. And more recently, the pressure has been on to expand that right even further to people who suffer not grievous, irremediable physical conditions, but rather mental suffering, such as clinical depression. So you've got people who don't want to live anymore. They're physically robust, healthy, fine, but they want to die. And they said the drugs haven't worked, therapy hasn't worked, they don't find any joy in life, they just want to die. Now, it's very hard to say, well, physical suffering is inherently worse than this kind of mental suffering. These people are suffering terribly, and they too want to have access, some of them, to the right to have euthanasia. And so right now, that question is there's a moratorium on it until March of 2027 in Canada within Parliament to discuss that issue, and we come back to it again. But it's pretty clear where the drift is going, that we're going down this slippery slope pretty fast, and there's a reasonable expectation that it will be extended to people who have clinical depression. Now, this has all sorts of other terrible outcomes. For example, giving access to physician assisted suicide inherently undercuts alternative measures such as therapy and emotional support and palliative care. It guts palliative care. And so it really is a zero-sum game. The more that the medical establishment focuses on euthanasia, the less impetus there is to seek new and effective ways to provide palliative care to people in the final days, months, weeks of life. And so it undercuts palliative care. It also, when you introduce this right, it now, for many people, could create pressure to take euthanasia even if they do not want to. Let's say, for example, that you have somebody who they themselves don't want to die, but they just want to have their family to love and support them through the journey of dying over the next potentially, let's say, 12, 18 months. But they also know that that is going to exert a very great emotional and financial cost on their family. They may well sense the pressure to end their own life through physician-assisted suicide, even if nobody has ever suggested it to them, but they still sense that pressure because they don't want to put their family through the financial and emotional strain of their death and their dying. And so this creates this pressure. Another area that is concerning is the impact that this has for marginalized groups, like the severely mentally handicapped, or disabled. Uh, and I interviewed Heidi Jans 10 years ago when I had a podcast. This is no longer online, unfortunately, but she's a disability advocate and herself has severe disabilities, and she's very strongly opposed to euthanasia. She has a high quality of life, but the interesting thing is, like, she can't speak, she can't bathe, she's limited to a wheelchair. I think she can't feed herself. She needs a full-time caregiver, but she has a wonderful quality of life. She has a PhD and she's a professor. Now you wonder, you really worry that with the slippery slope expansion of euthanasia, how what has happened and does happen is the expansion from voluntary requested euthanasia to involuntary benevolently imposed euthanasia, where external parties say, this life is not worth living. We think this person should die, and we're going to benevolently, on their behalf, take their life. And that happens. And it happens because you've introduced the space of this. So that's another concern, the expansion, again, slippery slope into involuntary euthanasia. Now, there are many other problems as well. But for me to say that I'm very much in agreement with Trent on my concerns about medical assistance in dying legislation and euthanasia. Now I want to talk about what I disagree with Trent on. He talked about it as human sacrifice. He said it's a kind of human sacrifice. And what is interesting in particular is this is not an anomaly. I hear this time and again with respect to abortion as well. People, pro-life advocates, talk about abortion as human sacrifice. Sometimes they'll even go further and talk about the god Molech and offering your child to the god Molech as a sacrifice. Now, I kind of get what the point of the rhetoric is. I think what people like Trent Horn and these other apologists and conservative evangelical ethicists are doing rhetorically is launching a critique, is saying you have made an idol out of your own desires, your own self-interest, your will to avoid suffering, your desire to have high quality of life, your desire to maintain full control over your bodily processes in dying, or your desire in the case of abortion to not have to be have your life interrupted by a pregnancy and so on and so on. And because you've chosen these things selfishly, you are essentially sacrificing a child on the altar in the case of abortion, or you're sacrificing a human life in the case of physician assisted suicide. And so it's quote unquote human sacrifice. I get that as a kind of rhetoric. I also think that that's incredibly unhelpful. I don't think that that illumines either one of these issues at all. I think it just amps people up. It makes them angrier. It adds more heat and doesn't add any light. And honestly, I've talked to enough people in the pro-life movement, specifically where this concerns abortion, that they seem to think in some, it's not just some rhetorical, hyperbolic statement, but in some way they think it's literally true that you're sacrificing your child and offering your child to Molech. So it even kind of people lose the plot and begin to think of it in literal terms as human sacrifice, which makes them even angrier and less apt to understand the complexities of the issues that are being debated. So, with that in mind, I think it's unfortunate that someone as intelligent and winsome as Trent Horn uses that kind of rhetoric to refer to euthanasia as human sacrifice, which it clearly is not. This is where we get into devil's advocate, the importance of devil's advocacy. If you cannot present the views of your opponent winsomely, then you probably don't understand those views. Now, sometimes there are terrible, indefensible views, and there's no way to credibly state those views, like flat earth, the flat earth theory or something like that, or anti-vax theories. Sorry, but yeah, I don't think that those are defensible, and I don't think there's any sense of steel manning them in a way that is not just outright denying the deliverances of medical science. But there are other cases, in fact, most cases, where there is a reasonable case to be had for the alternative view. And in the case of euthanasia, I would just give one example. I'm imagining that I've just been diagnosed with ALS, with Lou Gehrig's disease. And I have probably about 2 years to live as a result. I'm going to go into rapid decline, and over the next several months, my body's going to gradually lose power to move and become paralyzed. And in all likelihood, at some point in the future, I will probably suffocate. I will lose the ability to breathe. And that as the the paralysis moves up into my lungs, my larynx, and so on, I'm going to lose the ability to breathe, and I will probably suffocate and die in that way, which is a pretty terrible way to die. And I'm thinking, if I was facing that, would I want to have access to physician-assisted suicide as a possibility? Even if I never availed myself of that possibility, but just knowing if the suffering ever got too much, if that overwhelming fear of suffocation and the agony of becoming a paraplegic, becoming a quadriplegic, losing everything, and facing that imminent death, if that ever became too great, I could have this way out. And that in turn would then lighten the burden in the weeks and months to come, knowing that I had that as a possibility. I gotta say that I see the appeal of that. And when I look at physicians and medical ethicists and the general population, and they're arguing for physician-assisted suicide, and they're thinking of cases like that, at the very least, I've got sympathies with that. I understand where that position is coming from, and I certainly don't think it is fair to describe the terror of facing a terrible death by ALS. I don't think it's fair to say that people who are facing that are offering themselves on the altar as a human sacrifice, nor that the medical establishment that is willing to provide that service to people under such egregious conditions is engaged in human sacrifice. I find that just to be a very uncharitable way of thinking about these issues. So I would say set aside this rhetoric, this exaggerated, hyperbolic, incendiary rhetoric, and focus on the issues. Focus on issues like the slippery slope and the expansion of this right to include not only people who are so physically suffering, but mentally suffering, even children, and expanding potentially into involuntary euthanasia. And consider all the other issues, the pressure it places on people to accept euthanasia, the way it places marginal populations at greater threat. Um, and think about those things and debate those things, but don't simply fall for this incendiary rhetoric that adds heat but no light.